Hello everyone and welcome to the third part of my building review series about the diorama with the title The Crash. In the previous part we assembled the T34 and the StuG III. Now we get to the BMW R12, the diorama base and the figures. Let's start with the BMW R12 by IBG Models. Normally I would have selected the very nice R12 kit by Zvezda, which I have built a few times in the past already, but I was interested in comparing it to the kit by IBG Models. That kit was first released in the year 2009, and at the first glance it seems to be very sophisticated and detailed. The instructions are typical for IBG and are not very clearly arranged, so be careful. First we glue the four wheels together. Two are meant for the motorbike, one belongs to the sidecar, and the fourth is a spare wheel. Each wheel is slightly different, so make sure you don't mix up the parts. Due to the high part count, the level of detail is fine, but the fit of the parts is not too great. We need a couple of clamps to hold the tires together until the glue has dried. The engine block consists of several parts as well, but the fit seems to be a bit better here. I think it says a lot about the kit that I was already slightly annoyed at this stage and preferred to continue with the supposedly easier sidecar. The shell of the sidecar consists of two halves and a lid for the cargo bay. Again, I had to struggle with the poor fit of the parts. There was quite a severe mismatch of the two shell halves, which required some careful filing and sanding to get rid of the big seam line. Finally, I added the springs, the axle, mudguard and wheel to the sidecar. Now I felt like I could continue with the bike. Various funny arrows point out the locations where we are supposed to install several bits and pieces to the mainframe. The depiction is not the clearest for sure, and I advise you to break this up into several steps. First I attached the connector pieces to one side of the frame. Then I proceeded with building the other components, like the fuel tank or the rear mudguard. There were a couple of bad seam lines to remove as well. I don't get to use my files too often, but this small model here required a lot of filing and sanding. Once the drive shaft is glued to the rear axle, we can very carefully start to assemble the parts of the mainframe. There were no serious fit issues here, and I could continue with the handlebar and the front axle. The worst section of the build was over now, and the remaining assemblies were much easier. The small bits and pieces did not cause any issues, and even the instructions were clear about their positions. To attach the sidecar to the motorbike, I recommend to use superglue, because Tamiya Extra Thin is not strong enough and my trusted Revell contactor glue takes too long to set. In order to make the model a bit more interesting, I decided to glue on a few stowage pieces at this stage already. Unfortunately, the MG34 of the kit is not usable, because it only remotely resembles the real thing. Because of that, I replaced it with a much better part by Dragon. The other parts of the stowage came mostly from Dragon as well. apart from the tarp mounted on the pillion, which came from the BMW R12 kit by Zvezda, I believe. This completes the assembly of the R12. Unfortunately, I have to say that I did not enjoy it to assemble this model, because the kit is very complicated and is hampered by a bad fit of some parts. I recommend everyone who wants to build the R12 motorbike in 1/35 scale the Zvezda kit. The assembly of that kit is not easy either, but the parts fit pretty well and you get a few figures in the kit as well. The level of detail is also slightly better in my opinion. It costs about €2 more than the IBG kit, which is not something to worry about. Now we can build the diorama base. The base is ideally formed by a rectangular wooden plate or a picture frame. The difficult part is to find something with the ideal size. The base should not be too small for the models, nor too big. Everything has to fit on the base in the end without overloading it. There should be no big empty spaces too. Besides that, I recommend to aim for a slightly diagonal arrangement. It adds a lot of interest to the scene. Usually I don't have a wooden board of the right size at hand, so I normally use my bandsaw to get a board of the right size. A diorama looks much more professional and interesting if you add a slightly raised frame. We will build such a frame using balsawood plates. First I cut the balsawood plates so they match the size of the wooden base plate, and then I glue them on with some PVA glue. Some tape holds it all together. Then I glue in some Styrofoam plates. PVA glue is ideal for that as well, because it does not attack the Styrofoam. As you can see, I'm not stingy with the PVA glue. The rule is here, the more the better. Again, we use some tape to hold it all together until the glue has dried. I like to use this blue tape by Tesa because it adheres very well and is also easy to remove again. As you can see, the corners of the frame are not very nice looking, so I get them into shape with my sanders. It might be necessary to use some filler around the corners. I recommend to use ordinary wood filler for that. Now we can cut out the overall shape of the terrain. I like it when the frame of the diorama follows exactly the contour of the terrain. Luckily, it is easy to cut the balsa wood with a knife even after it has been glued. Of course, one could determine the shape of the frame beforehand, but that is not as easy as it might sound. It is much easier to work on the actual shape of the frame and terrain at a later stage in one go. It is obviously a very big mess with all those styrofoam shreds, but that's why clever people invented the broom and vacuum cleaners. That's how the base looks like after the cutting process. Now we can continue with the groundwork of our diorama. First, I apply a thin layer of repair grout by PCI right on top of the styrofoam. This creates a firm base with maximum grip for all the following layers of materials. I simply mix the grout with some water and apply it on the diorama. It is not necessary to care much for details at this stage. It is sufficient to simply apply a fairly even layer of grout on the styrofoam. You can also use ordinary plaster as a substitute, but it's not equally strong and provides not the same grip. How long you have to wait for the grout to dry depends on the product you used. In my case, it takes about 24 hours. Next we can go into a bit more detail and give the ground its final form. I like to use air drying modeling clay for that task, like Fimo Air Basic by Stettler or modeling clay by Casa Deco. In the past I have worked a lot with Fimo Air Basic, but this time I felt like giving the modeling clay by Casa Deco a try. The application of both modeling clay materials is exactly the same. You can simply smear it on with your fingers. I recommend to dip your fingers in water from time to time. The coarse grout underneath provides a very good basis for the modeling clay to adhere to. I recommend to let the modeling clay dry for about 24 hours until you proceed. This time can be used efficiently to assemble our figures. The scene we want to depict here is heavily influenced by a photo, which we have examined in part 1 of this build review series already. The photo shows a couple of German soldiers who are either standing in front of the two vehicles or have a closer look at them. There are a couple of figure kits around, which contain a few figures which come fairly close to the poses of the soldiers in the photo, but some of the figures we need are not available at all and can only be created by small and bigger conversions. Of course, it is possible to sculpt the figures entirely yourself, but this is a skill I have yet to master. Until I get there, I can only rely on converting plastic figures I have at hand. Luckily, I have a huge assortment of figure kits and figure parts, so I can usually unearth the suitable arms and heads by digging through my spare parts box. This requires a lot of time, but it's also very enjoyable. In the end, each figure is a unique piece. You just have to make sure that the proportions of the different body parts look right in the end. The figures by Tamiya are very small, for example, but the figures by Academy are way too big. Some brands offer us figures which are pretty compatible with the figures of other brands out there. In my case, I mainly relied on figures and figure parts by Dragon, MiniArt, Masterbox, ICM and TriStar. They are all quite similar with regard to their size and general look. Of course, you have to expect a few gaps and fit issues here and there, even with figures you build right out of the box. Usually, filling and sanding cannot be avoided entirely. However, only in extreme cases you have to deploy ordinary filler. In most cases, it is sufficient to use the very good Mr. Surfacer liquid filler. That stuff can simply be brushed on and fills small gaps and imperfections. It is usually not necessary to use a sander afterwards. Finally, we glue on the equipment parts to the figures, like ammunition pouches, entrenching tools, bread bags, weaponry, and so on. I like to use the equipment parts of the Gen 2 series by Dragon for that, because it is some of the best stuff available in 1/35 scale. I have a lot of those parts in my spare parts box. The carrier straps of the guns are usually not included in the figure kits. Only on rare occasions they include photo-etched straps. This means we have to make these straps ourselves. This is easy to do though. We simply use paper. I noticed that the firm, slightly glossy paper of ICM instruction sheets is the best material for that. First, I cut off a thin strip of paper and use some super glue to attach it to one end of the rifle. Then I estimate the required length of the strap and glue the other end of the paper strip to the front section of the rifle. The protruding section of the paper gets cut off and we can simply bend the paper strap into a realistic shape. As soon as we like the shape, we soak the paper with some super glue. The paper strip solidifies and the paint will adhere to it nicely. This method also works for the straps of shouldered rifles, as you can see on this figure here. I simply glued the paper strap over the molded on plastic strap on his chest. Now the basic assembly work of the diorama is completed. Everything is ready for painting. I tried to reproduce the scene of the photo as closely as possible and arranged everything in such a way that the scene looks interesting and we don't end up with big empty areas. Each figure interacts in some form with another figure or with the vehicle, so it should look pretty lifelike in the end. To decorate the base, I will use these two emblems. Those are cheap reproductions, which have roughly the same size and should look nice in the end. Now we are at the end of the third part of this building review series. In the next part, we will continue with painting and weathering the T34. Thank you very much for watching and see you again next time. Your Hamilkar Barkas.